in our Learning C# with Sally sessions. In the last session, we talked a little bit about building a CRUD operations capability. Sally went out there and basically she created a PR, and this PR is basically for the delete function actually. So this is for the delete function. If you go into the files change, you'll see that she has the test in here. She basically created a test. The test basically says go ahead and retrieve a book by its ID. And then, that book that comes back, which is the input book, go ahead and delete that book. So this is basically what this remove by ID would do. And then the implementation here is basically to go and say, select book by ID and then delete the book and all that. Now, Sally, you had a question for me. You said, Hassan, I don't understand in some places, like, let's go to OSSS here real quick. You know, a lot of people asked me this question before. A lot of people said, Hassan, I don't understand when you are, let's say, for instance, you're doing the fees, and let's say for the remove, for instance, for the fees, we create a random feed ID, right? And not this one. Let's go to the validations, or rather the sorry, the logic basically for the feed or remove. Okay, so in here it says something to the effect of this is should retrieve, should modify, and then here should remove. Okay, so the question here is we create a random fee, right? Sometimes we just create a random ID. We don't really try to extract the ID from the fee itself, So instead of input fee ID, we just say give me a random fee ID that I'm passing in, and whatever that fee ID is, go ahead and retrieve some fee ID and then go ahead and delete it, right? Uh, the the question here is, and let me kind of increase the font here so people on their phones can actually see. Sometimes you say just make a random ID. I don't really care about how accurate this is, at least at this stage in time. And why is that? A lot of people would say, why is that a thing? Let's go back into the blackboard here and let's talk about this for a second. Sometimes it's a little bit, hard to kind of make the distinct between what the service is responsible for versus what the broker is responsible for. So you have a foundation service in here, and you have a storage broker in here, or let's say broker in here, right? The broker's responsibility is to communicate the signal that's going from the foundation service and then respond back with some values, right? So there are two actions that are going here. There is a send request and there is a response that's going on here. Let's talk about those a little bit in here. So the service responsibility is to go and tell the broker in here, go ahead and retrieve, let's put this in a box. Go ahead and retrieve this by ID. So this is my guy here, and I'm gonna go and say retrieve, or select by ID. Select book by ID. And we're passing in here some ID. Right? So that's what this service is doing. So far, so good, right? And then this guy's response is to go back and give us back some book of some kind. So this is here where return a book. Return book. Cool. Now, in this scenario here, who's really responsible about actually executing the query? The person that's actually, which component in here that's actually doing the actual filtering against the data storage in here?
Foundation.
No, the foundation is only delegating. The foundation here is going and saying, hey, go select by ID. However you do it, I don't know. Like this guy internally in here is doing the selection in here. So this happen in here that, execute filtering against storage.
What do you mean exactly by? Oh, filtering by selecting the book. You mean okay?
Yeah.
Confuse it with validating input.
Yep. No, the validation, we're gonna jump into it in a second, but this guy here only responsibility, all that it cares about, that it's sending a signal and saying, hey, select by ID. I don't care how you do it. I just know that you're offering me a capability or an API that tells me go select that book by ID. And then all I know that when I send you this signal that you're gonna return a book to me.
I see.
Okay, now Since we're testing this component here and not this component, it really doesn't matter whether the book that's coming back matches that ID or not. We don't care. What we're really testing is this piece here, that this guy is sending this signal. This piece here is out of our scope. We don't care.
Mhm.
It's out of the scope. So that basically means that if I go and write my code and say, you know, give me a give me an ID from a book, I'm gonna pass you even an empty ID if I don't care. An empty ID. What I really want to ensure though is that the ID that was passed in to me as an input parameter from the request that's coming in, this ID here, whatever was passed in to me, this is your input ID, is
Mhm.
the same ID that is being sent to the broker. That we need to test. But why? But what happens behind the scene on the broker level? We don't care. Whether it's returning a book that matches or not, that's outside of the scope of our test. And this is something, the question that you just asked me, I've been asked this question by some of the most seasoned engineers out there. I just want you to just understand that this is something because you're writing unit tests, so it's at the unit level. The most important part about developing software this way is to focus, be laser focused on the idea that I only need to test the things that are within my scope, within my scope. Now, whether, from the overall view picture, whether that fits into that narrative and that idea, of course, we know that if you pass in an ID, this guy's going to give you back the book with that matches the same ID, but that's outside of our concern at this moment. We're just trying to see if this foundation service is doing the right thing by receiving an ID and passing an ID and receiving a response, and are we returning that response? How it happens, don't care. It's not our problem. Okay. It will be our problem later when we build a different type of tests that we call acceptance tests. And acceptance tests are actually tests that will go and say, here is your service, here's your controller for your API, here is your service, here is your broker, and I'm gonna send you a request and I wanna make sure the world is perfect. Like if I said this, it goes in this and this, and then it comes back to me all the way down here, and I wanna make sure that you're actually communicating with the storage. All of these things will be a part of another higher level test that's passing in the happy paths, only the happy paths, which is what I call acceptance tests. Acceptance tests. Does that make sense? So this is basically the consensus or the idea. There's also system tests, which is testing a service to service. We will explore all of these. We'll explore all of these one by one, and we'll see, what's the difference is. There's, the world of architecting software and building, standardized enterprise level software is full of amazing ideas and amazing things that I can't wait to share with you. But for now, this is a great question. We're just focusing on the things that matter. There will be situations, and this is also a very common question that some people throw at me. They'll be like, Hassan, you're throwing, let me show you an example here that kind of makes, people scratch their heads, when it comes to handling exceptions. Let me show you an example. So in here, for instance, you will see on OSSS is undergoing a massive changes in terms of upgrading to the latest standard, which lucky for you, you'll just get to the latest and greatest piece right away. But there will be situations where you see, let's say in here, for instance, if we're handling the exceptions for add, for instance, you will see us going and doing this. See, in the even some people went and did it. Just give me 1 second. Let's see. Let's see here. Maybe on the students test students, and then if I go into add students in here, yeah. So some people change this a little bit, but ideally you'll see me calling this broker current date time, and I'm throwing the SQL exception from my date time broker. Although that your date time broker will never ever throw a SQL exception. But we don't care. I just want to see how my service operates when when a SQL exception happens. Right? So it looks like we have a lot of code rub to clean up. I'll give you a lot of these tasks so you can actually get your hands dirty with writing a lot of code. There's always an opportunity everywhere. Like right now, we're undergoing a lot of massive changes for upgrading the standard, and a lot of people are working on that together, and I really appreciate people's efforts into doing that work. But anyway, all right, so you get the point. We're basically going and saying focus only on how the service is supposed to behave rather than trying to let your unit test kind of spill its scope outside of that realm, right? What we care about is that whatever we pass in is the same as what we pass into this guy, whether it matches the book ID or not, completely out of our scope, something we don't care about. Okay. All right, let's go a little bit further and let's talk about your PR. I think, from um on your PR side, let's take a look at this and see, the take a look at the PR here real quick. This is a different project. Repositories, Ali's library. You have your pull request. So on the pull request side, you're basically going and saying this is file change, and you went ahead and you basically said this is removed by ID. Sounds good to me. I see your PR. The one thing I have for you here, though, is that we like to break these setup into three statements because in here you're saying three things. There is the setting up piece, and then there is the function that you want to set up, and then there's the return.
Mhm.
Normally, we try to make sure that our code is not longer than 120 characters. If it's longer than 120 characters, it becomes harder for people to kind of scroll horizontally, right? To go back and forth between this. So how do we do this? We basically go like this and we say something to the effect of C sharp. Go ahead, Sally, you want to say something?
No.
Yeah, okay, okay. So instead, I go in here and basically say something to the effect of this dot storage broker mock dot setup like this, and here's a broker. And then I take in, well, it's not gonna let me do 1, 2, 3, 4. I guess that's a tab. Broker dot select by ID, right? And that's your input book ID
Yeah,
like this. And then I
I
go,
did in your writing that you break it up. I didn't understood what was the reason.
yes, it's code cleanliness and the ability to be able to look at the code and be able to understand what it's doing. You're actually doing three things. You're doing something that I call chaining. You're chaining things. So there's a statement and there's another statement, there's another statement. I try to make my code look a lot like poetry. I don't know if you know this guy Rumi. You probably do. Rumi? Poetry? No?
Of
Poetry?
course. Of
Yeah. You ever heard of this dude? He's
course.
he's a
Yeah.
Jalaluddin Muhammad al-Rumi. Ever heard of that dude? You probably did. So he was really uh-huh. Go ahead. Go ahead.
My name is Khayyam. No, sorry. Yeah, room. I forgot. Okay. There's another name we use.
Not not a not 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 Ibn Hayyan. No, that's a different one.
No, no,
Okay.
not it's a Khayyam.
Oh, I see. I see. I see. If you look at this guy's poems, and this guy influenced my code a lot. If you go into his poems, look how he's breaking his thoughts into different pieces like this. That's literally what we're doing in here. What I'm doing in here, and that's like culture meets code meets, I don't know what to tell you. Like in here, let me show you what, setting up our storage mock, right, on the select by ID method that will return book. Look at this dude here, how he's breaking his thoughts, and this is how I'm breaking my thoughts. Poem and code. I don't know what else to tell you. Right? But also like from a cognitive resources standpoint, and this is what I always tell people, when you sit down and you read a lot of code, if the code is not comfortable to read, it's going to consume too much of your brain power. Okay, it's going to consume a lot of your brain power. So the easier is the code to read, the more likely for you to be able to survive reading millions and millions of lines of code throughout your career without actually having to kind of get tired too soon. Okay, so what I'm doing now is basically leaving you a review. So I'm basically going here and saying, hey, fix this to match this pattern. Okay, so to match this pattern, so on and so forth. All right. So that's the comment, and then I will see me here saying something to the effect of do the same for the rest. Right? Do you want to go ahead now and share your screen and fix this part before we merge the code?
Maybe I can do it later
You want to do
because
it later? That's fine.
we have a
Also,
with sharing. So.
yeah, that's fine. Also, one more thing, in here, make sure a single line of code doesn't need an empty line between them, right? Single lines of code, doesn't need a line between them. Where did I get that from? You'll see something here called the C# standard. The C# standard will basically help you kind of go and understand, this is another repository that I will include here in the recorded session for our YouTube channel. Let me show you here an example of this here real quick. Here's an example. Basically say multiple declarations. Declarations that occupy 2 lines or more should have a new line before and after them to separate them. So for instance, do something like this because this is 2 lines of code. But if you have declarations that only consume 1 line of code, you don't have to create a new space between them. Like don't do that like this. Okay, so I'm gonna leave a comment here and I'm gonna go and say, see, I'm gonna pick up the standard here and then I'm gonna go back here and say between them, please refer to our C# coding standard. This process here is very common in the software industry, something called code reviews, right? You go and look into each and every aspect of the code and make sure, and this is very, very common and very popular between team members. Like team members do this all the time. You'll see this all the time, the thing about code reviews is that it's fair for the most part. People try to follow a standard and they try to make sure that their implementation and their code is the same set of standards. Like if someone looks at OSSS today, you wouldn't know how many people actually built this unless you look at the history because it follows a very strict standard. It's follows a very strict way of writing the code. Okay, so these are the only 2 comments. I don't have anything else. Maybe we don't need the empty space in here. Remove empty lines. That's 1 comment in here. That's one part. And then let's see what else is in there. Yeah, that's it. So normally what engineers do is that they go and look at something like this and be like, oh, there's still some comments in here. And then you address the comments and then you move on. Once the comments are addressed, you have 3 comments. Sorry, you have 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 3 comments in here. If you address all of these comments as the repository maintainer, I will come back and say 4 comments, sorry. I will come back and say this VR is ready to be merged. All right. Okay. Now let's jump into the next step in our learning session here. And the next step here, the most important part that we have to work on here is basically understand validations. Understand validations. So let me open up Sally's library here real quick and let's see the project. And let me increase the font on my screen here just to make sure that people can see. This is 175. Here is my screen. Let me know if you can see the code, Sally.
No, I can.
Okay.
It's a good font.
Can or cannot?
I can. Okay.
Can. Okay. Let me go get latest from master, origin, master. Or is it main? I don't know. What did we build it as? I think it's master. I can see it down here. Okay. Let me just pull the latest here. Okay. So this basically pulled a whole history of changes that we've made to this repository. If I want to go and say, what's the history here? It looks like, we have merged a pull request for you before on modify. We created some branch and we made some changes in here.
Mhm.
Okay, let's go back into, let me see my code base here. Let me see if things are building first. Always when you pull up new code, you want to basically run and see. We have a bunch of warnings.
Yeah, I think the modify one is messed up.
Yeah, and these warnings are kind of annoying. Let me go and fix the issues. So nullable, disable. I don't want to check for nullable, and I don't want it to check for implicit using. So if I go back in here, all these errors should disappear. There you go. Now if I build again, always make sure that your code is not producing warnings or any of that. Something as clean as this. Now let's run the unit tests for this guy. So let's go here and say .NET test. Boom. All the tests are passing. It's all bunnies and rainbows out there. Love it. Okay, let's do this. So, okay, so I have everything in here. I have the view. So what are we talking about today? We created this book model. We went ahead and we created a logic function that goes and says create a random book and then pass in the book in here and all that. I'm going to stay on the add function in here. Now, here's the deal. It's really, really important, and bear with me on this one because this is really important and usually very um seldom that people would look on this and be like, oh, we need to do validations and all that kind of stuff. Some people do, some people don't, but I'll explain this in a second. If you are a broker neighboring service, let's say you're a service in here and you're offering this capability that's called add book, right? You can't just be a bridge that just goes in here and says, okay, give me a book and then insert a book. Because a part of the responsibility of a foundation service, in addition to the fact that it needs to validate, to communicate and integrate, it needs to validate, process, and integrate. What does that really mean? If I go back into the Blackboard here, explain this a little bit better. You may or may not have read this in the standard, but I'll repeat some of it in here. When a request comes in, there are 3 stages that the request goes through to be able to be persisted, and the function as a foundation service is completing its purpose as a function in here. So what is the foundation service doing really? Okay. So we're trying to add a book. So I have a book request coming in that's saying, "Hey, add me to the foundation services." There's a big view here. This is our book service. I'm gonna put a label on that guy here and say this is our book service, book foundation service. Okay, that's the book service that we have. And this book foundation service is supposed to do a few things: validation, processing, and integration. Some services do some services do all, some services, but these are the 3 things that almost most of these foundation services do. And you can't move from one stage to the other unless you go for the first stage first. Sometimes you have double of them, like you do validation before and after, like validation before and after processing, or validation before and after integration.
Mhm.
So far, the part that we have completed is just integration, which is the piece where we go and say something to the effect of insert book by ID, insert book, which is the one in here. Insert book. This is the only part that we have right now. But there are parts that we haven't completed yet, right? What are these parts? The other parts here is the validation to make sure that this book that's coming in is in good standing in terms of models. As a model, it needs to be in a good shape. Like we can't allow bad, corrupt data. Think about your foundation service as a traffic officer, right? It's making sure nobody passes by unless they are validated. They have the right license plates. They have the registration. They have everything in good shape. So today you and I are going to explore this aspect in here, which is the validation. How do we validate? And we're going to take it really slow. How do we validate that this object that's coming into my service, into my foundation service, matches the criteria that it would allow this data to be persisted in my storage. Does that make sense? Do you have questions about any of that?
No, so far clear.
Okay. So foundation, we have validation, processing, and integration. We already figured the integration part. It goes and says, here's a database. Go ahead and talk to this database and go ahead and communicate and send the data to the database. No problem there. Our database in this particular scenario is not really a huge database. It's just a memory, it's just a list. But this is how we're simplifying things. We're starting things really simple. Okay, then we need a validate function in here. And this validate function will go and say, make sure that the data that's coming in is in good shape. So that's what we're going to be working on today. I'm going to put that in orange because that means we're still working on this piece. Okay, let's go back to the code. I'm going to go back here and say, well, first of all, when you try to validate an object, the first thing that we want to think about whether this object is existent at all. Like, is this object that is being passed in, is it null or not? Right? Like if I can go at any point in time in here, let's say I'm using your foundation service. If I go to program.cs in here and I go and say add null, nothing is going to happen. And this service won't complain because there's nothing like if I go and run my application here and go and say, let's see here, Sally, if I go here and say .NET, .NET run project, and then I go in here and say Sally app, and then app, where's your, there you go. If I go and run this guy, I always forget how to, I always do this. So let's see, .NET run project. Let's see here, one sec. Yeah, I always also spell project wrong. I was just with Sam this morning, Sam Zoo, and I literally misspelled the name project exactly the same way. Okay, now let's run this. So you see, when I ran this, nothing happened. Nothing happened. My service didn't complain. It said, we're good. Going through, no problem. So it actually did add a null value to my storage. And that's a bad thing. That's a bug in the code. That means that your code is allowing corrupt data to go through your system. Now, what are we going to do about this? In object-oriented programming, there's this concept that we have that we call exceptions. And exceptions are basically representations of things that are outside of the happy path. Outside of the happy path. The happy path is to be able to have the perfect book going through the system and this book being persisted in the database. Exceptions is anything that diverts out of this happy path. We represent the errors that happen in the system in a model or a contract that we call exceptions. So what's the case that I'm trying to validate against? I'm saying when the coming in input is null, then go ahead and throw an exception called null book exception. Null book exception. Null book exception is us basically going and saying, I have an issue with the book that was passed in that it doesn't have the minimum criteria to be persisted in my system. Well, then I need to communicate a message. We have this thing called a constructor, and the constructor basically says, do you want to add anything to your error? No, I don't, but I'm going to inherit from the same. Don't worry about this base part yet. It's a little bit too advanced, but I'm basically going and saying, book is null. That's all. Just a simple message, pure and simple. And this message will basically show up and say, when the book is null, make sure that this error propagates. This error blows up. Okay, so I created a contract, a model that will reflect the issue that my system is going through. But that's not enough. We need to use it, right? We need to be able to go and say when this issue happens, then go ahead and throw that exception, right? But more importantly, yeah, we'll come to that part in a second. Let's just go up in here and say, this is my test. I'm gonna go back to my add test and I'm gonna create a new file. And this file will contain all my validations, all the things that I do for validation. So I'm gonna go here and say, see, you see how we said logic add, logic retrieve, logic modify, and all that? Now we're saying validations add.
Mm.
Validations add, right? Okay, let's go into validations add. And let's write a new test. This test is gonna be very interesting though. I'll tell you why. I'm gonna go up in here and say public void should throw null book exception on add if book is null.
Mm.
Easy and simple. You should throw null book exception if the book is null. Great. Given when then, I'm going up in here and saying, here is a null book that equals null.
Mhm.
And I'm gonna go up in here and say, well, you know, here is the action. And the action meaning that I don't want to run the method yet, but I will run it in a second. So this is add book action. And this add book action basically will call this service that we have. This dot service dot add book, and it has this null book in it. And I'll tell you what we're gonna do with this action. So this is not the same way we're doing this because in here we're waiting for the answer,
Mhm.
right? In here we're not waiting for the answer. We're waiting for this error to happen. So we can say, oh no, an error happened. So I'm gonna go up in here and say assert throws null book exception. I'm basically going here and saying when this action actually execute, the add book action, then a null book exception should happen. When this guy runs, this guy didn't run yet. This is this method in here. I didn't run it yet. I had to take it and put it inside this function here. And I'm basically saying when you run this with the null book in here, make sure that it throws null book exception. Cool. There's something more that needs to happen that we need to verify in here. If the book is null, what are we not going to do if the book is null?
Not running, not adding.
Not adding. So that basically means I don't have to go. I want to go and make sure that my storage broker mock, this broker with insert book of any book, it doesn't matter what I'm passing in, will never be called. I'm basically going and saying, if this book is null, never call the storage. Don't touch the storage. Cool. Okay. So this is here. I think I'm missing a couple of, there you go. Like this, never. Oh, verify, not setup. There you go. There is a verify here, but there is no setup, right? Why there is no setup? Because it's not going to be called. We only set things up if they're going to be called and we expect them to return something so we can move forward with our test, right?
Mhm.
There's one more thing missing here. What else should we verify? What do you think?
Okay. Well, it book is well in terms of nulls or just outside the accepted null. Because book can be something like something else, right?
What was that? Repeat that sentence. Sorry, I
Oh,
missed you.
mm. Are you mean in the scope of null book?
Yeah, in the scope of this test, we need to verify something else will not happen. We need to verify that the dependency will never be called in any other way. Not
Oh,
just this part,
yes.
but it will not be called. Some people tell me, well, this can substitute this. If you're verifying no other calls, why do you have to tell this? I always tell people because we need to tell the story. We need to tell people what would have been called if this exception didn't happen.
Yeah, that's what come to my mind. Okay. Mhm.
Okay, let's see if this test fails. Here we go. Ah, the test is failing. Look, what's the exception? What's the error that we're getting? It's basically saying, I expected you to throw null book exception, but in reality, you didn't throw nothing.
Mhm.
Nothing has happened. So that's a good failing test. That's a test that basically tells me that this that the case that I'm trying to test against is true. So that's one part. Okay. Now let's try and make this pass. Sally, let's go here and let's make this pass. Now we can't have a fat arrow function anymore. Instead, we're gonna go here and say if book is null, then throw new null book exception like this. If book is null, then throw new null book exception. And if you use that throw command here, you will never touch this one because you already exited the function completely. You already left. So let's see if that works. Let's go back here and let's run the test. Here we go. Pass. See this? So easy, right? Very simple, right? So this is, do you remember how when we were talking about test-driven development, we said we go from red to green and from green to what? Mm, you remember? We said we do fail and then we do pass and then we do something else before we go to fail again. Fail,
Mm.
pass, something else. What was the third stage? Refactor. Refactor. Refactor basically going and saying, if my code looks good, let me go back to our recording here real quick. I might have been saying that to someone else. For all I care, I could probably have been. Let's go
Okay.
here. Let's go back to this guy. Let's go back to where exploring
Or
GitHub code spaces, test-driven development, first steps. Let's see, did I do this in here? Let's see, did I say it? Let's see, let's go back. I really genuinely want to know. Yeah, there it is. Remember? Fail, pass, refactor. Fail, pass, refactor.
Mhm.
Okay, let's go back to the code here.
Just a
And let's,
refactor somehow like reorganize it, like make it looks nice.
yeah, make it
Like,
readable.
oh, in what
So
sense?
make it readable, meaning that every statement will talk only about one thing. Like here you have three statements, 3 lines or more, or at least 2 lines. This is one line and this is the second line. They're
Mhm.
both talking about the same thing. They're both talking about handling when the book is not null.
Mhm.
So why don't we take this and do control period and extract a method and say validate book is not null. You will hear a lot of people in the industry say, oh, only create methods when the same logic is going to be used in multiple places. That's wrong. I don't believe in that. Create methods and extract methods away. So every single statement at the higher level method is speaking and talking about one action and one action only. It all comes down to these three things: validation, processing, and integration. So technically any method at the foundation level should have only at least 3 lines of code.
Mhm.
One for validation, one for processing, and one for integration. But putting these methods together in here is problematic because now I'm confused. I have here CRUD operations, but I have here other methods that are supporting these methods. Where should I put these? C# has this cool thing called partial classes. And partial classes will allow you to go and create like subset of the same class. Like in here, we have a book service dot validations dot cs. So now I can nest files under files.
Mhm.
So now I can go here and say partial like this, and I can go in my book service and I can take that function here and hide it completely away from the site of the person that's reading the code. And only if they want to read more about the code and how the code is working, they can go dive deeper into, what this validation method is doing. But in reality, there's nothing for them to do here. So say we're back to this nice state where I have add, retrieve by ID, modify book. I didn't touch anything. Nothing, all good and dandy, because there's something else beneath that's handling all of that work for me. What do
One
you
thing.
think? Go
So
ahead.
you put a space between the line of validation book is null and the next one.
Yeah, and this rule of one liner, you shouldn't have a new line, only applies for all cases except when you say return. Let's go
Mm.
back in here. Let's go back into our C# coding standard. In the C# coding standard, if you go into our methods in here, you will see a place here where I say something to the effect of here, do with this, but don't stitch them together like this. In here, I basically say for multi-liner methods, take a new line between the method logic and the final return line, if any, even if they're one-liners.
Mhm. No, got that.
This is the only exception to this case. If you're having one-liners, make sure your return is always separated. Okay, so it says don't do this. See, if this is one liner and one liner and one liner, it says don't do this. You can do this rather, but also you can do this. All right, cool. Let's go back here. These things help a lot with the readability of the code. Okay, there's one more thing though. There's some more refactoring that we can do. I know this is validating book is not null, but I'm validating the book, so I don't have to be even verbose about what I'm doing. How about I just call this validate book, just like this. Whatever validations need to happen underneath this layer, let it be. It can be validating the book is not null. It can be whatever the case may be.
But how about like the type, for example? It wouldn't, you don't need to validate the type of the book. For example, someone inserts something wrong for that book type.
So let's say for instance, someone went in here. This is an advantage that we can get out of C# for free. So let's say I created a string name equals Sally.
Mhm.
And instead of a book being passed in, I'm passing in the name. This guy's gonna freak out because it violates the contract. The program won't run at all.
Mhm. Okay, that's not the case that will happen. Okay, now I got it.
Yeah, because the contract is dictating that it has to be of a particular type of book. So the validation here is built in.
Mhm. Okay.
This argument would be true, however, if we went in there and we said object, but we would never do that. Why? Because I'm literally saying add book. So I already made it clear that I want to add a book into my storage.
Mm.
What do you think? So now this statement will stand to be not able to be. And now let's test it again. So I already ran the test and all that, but do you remember this? When I run the code, it didn't do anything. Now when I run the code again, what's gonna happen? Watch. Oh, now it's saying, oh, you have a validation issue. Null book exception. Book is null.
Mm.
So your program here said something has happened that was not supposed to happen. And this something that happened that was not supposed to happen is that your system is experiencing an exception, an error. Now, this might be a little bit of an advanced topic, but usually, we say measure the commitment between the clients, the service, and the dependencies. based on the causes of the exceptions and its ratios in your system. What that basically means is that when you see exception, let's say you have 100 requests coming into your system. Someone is trying to add 100 books, right? Let's say the outcome is that there is 90 exceptions have occurred. These 90 exceptions that have occurred are happening for one of three reasons. Either the data is bad, which is okay. Either the service is bad, which is not okay, or the dependency is bad, which is also okay, because that's outside of your control.
Hmm.
If the data is bad, that's you going and saying, well, you gave me a bad book, a bad data to persist. But that's not the end of the story though, because if the data is bad and the data that's coming bad is 90, that means we need to talk to our customers. Say, hey guys, why are you posting so much bad code? Why are you posting so much bad records? Is it something that we couldn't agree on? Something that we miscommunicated? Something that, see, so your system now is reflective of the behavior of the consumers on that system.
Mhm.
Your system now is telling you, like, if you're getting 90 null exceptions, you need to go and start talking with your customers and telling them, hey, what's wrong? It's not something that's happening on your side, but in order for you to achieve, true perfection in this industry, you need to understand why people are posting bad data towards your system. It doesn't hurt your system in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't, but it hurts your customers and it hurts your business overall. What's the point? Let me tell you this. What's the point of building a service but nobody knows how to use it? Your service is perfect. It's throwing the right exceptions. The code is perfect. But from an entrepreneurial standpoint, the communication, that happened with the people that are consuming this service have failed because they continue to push data that's incorrect. But that's if and only if it's only driven by numbers. If you have 100 requests and 90 of them are failing, something is wrong. But if you have 100% and there is like 10 exceptions are happening, these are just people that you can't understand software for them. You can only provide them for documentation, but you can't understand it for them. You can go the extra mile and sit down with them and say, hey, how come you guys are pushing null books? That's not a real record, right? And they might say, oh, sorry, I didn't know. Thank you. Or they might say, oh, your code is wrong. Whatever the case may be, always remember this. You measure the commitment between the clients, the services, and the dependencies based on the causes of the exceptions and its ratios in your system. This is really, really important because just because you're building good software, it doesn't mean that you have a good market for that software. And just because you have a good market, it doesn't mean that the software that will be built for that market is good either. So you want to make sure that you, your customers, and your dependencies are all on the same line. Okay, my friend. So this here is what I call code rub. Code rub, and then move validations into its own file. Go like this. And we're gonna push the code. All right. So what's your assignment? You're gonna write a failing test and a passing test, and you're gonna create a PR. First of all, you're gonna address the issues in the PR that we talked about. But
So
your
basically for that, I should pull at the repository, yeah, in the Git. So that,
yes, you need to get latest because I updated the repository, right?
but the command is pull, right?
Yes, git pull.
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure
And
that.
if you don't see that code there, you're probably pulling the wrong thing. So make sure that the code that you pull in has this code in here.
Okay.
Okay. So there's that part. Now I want you to do this. In addition to addressing the comments in the code, I want you to try to do something very similar for modify book. If we're modifying a book and this book is null, actually, let me clean up this empty line. We don't need that. So this is another code drop here. Code drop. Remove extra line. Engineers, that actually honor their careers and they like to, or honor their profession. Screw the careers, honor their professions. They care so much about how their code looks like because that's their art, that's their poem. Just like I told you, Rumi writes poem, we write software, we write code, and we need our code to actually be as impactful and as beautiful as our poem. Okay? Any questions, comments, concerns?
Mm, The only things I think is left for me about cloning. I'm not. I mean deep cloner. So maybe next session we can dig down. So like when we do deep
The
cloning
cloning,
on,
deep cloning? Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. All
but
right.
I
Any?
will review those. I think
Okay.
I the concept, but in terms of the syntax, I have to do more practice.
Yes, the only way, so this is what I always tell people, you can never be a great software engineer until you do two things. You need to read code more than you write code. You need to read code more than you write code. And you need to write code more than you speak on daily basis. So they say the average number of words a person speaks is between 10,000 and 30,000 words a day.
Wow.
And maybe my data is outdated.
Yeah,
Maybe
before
my data is
pandemic, I
outdated.
guess.
Maybe before the pandemic, people were speaking 10,000. Now they're not speaking. Okay, average number of words a person speaks a day. Okay, so
2000,
between 16 and 15,000.
2014, yes.
Yeah, from 2014. These days, I don't know. Who knows, right? Who knows, right? So, and some people say 20 and 35,000, and some people say 10,000. I will go ahead and say 10,000, right? If you speak 10,000 words a day, you should write code that can be translated to more than 10,000 words every day. Not the code itself, like word for word, because code obviously is shorthand for longer expressions. Like for instance, when you go and say something to the effect of, if you go and type something like this, integer x equal 10, right? Words wise, you basically said, I think maybe 4 words. I will consider each and every one of those as a word. But when you translate this command, it would go into, declare a variable x that is equivalent to 10. How many words are these? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You should write code more than you speak every day, and you should read code more than you write code with the same ratio. Otherwise, believe me, like I've seen people, and this is just an advice, just something for you to just think about, and to the people watching us on YouTube. If you don't do that, you can see the difference so easily and fast between people who take this as a craft and those who take this as just a job. There's an article that I published a while back, something that's called employees and engineers. What's the difference between an employee and engineer? An employee works from 8 to 5 and they go home and they have nothing to do with software. Absolutely nothing to do with software. An engineer basically lives and breathes software. He thinks of everything in terms of software because they understand the power that they have in their hands and they need to harness that power and need to train for that power, right? Just like, bodybuilders and athletes and all that. They don't just go home and that's it. No, they work on their diet, they work on their, they do, push-ups, they wake up in the morning, they sharpen their axe. I don't know if it was Abraham Lincoln or someone. They said if I was given an axe, to cut a tree in 9 hours, I would spend 6 hours sharpening my axe and 3 hours actually cutting down the tree. Cutting the tree in this instance would be doing the actual work, and the sharpening the axe would be the training, that this work that you and I are doing right now. Okay, friend, we're good. So you got your assignment, you got
Mm,
your task, right? So
yeah.
how do we actually, programmatically and more systematically follow up on our assignments? I'm gonna go on my repository here. So Sally library. I'm gonna go in this repository and create something that's called an issue. I'm gonna go here and say create new issue. And in
Mhm.
here, issue, and I'm gonna go here and say add, this is foundations, add validations to modify routine or function. We need to add a null check validation for the modify routine
Mhm.
in the library. Just add null validation, null validations. So that's your assignment. How do you do it? When you create a pull request like this, you can go and attach the assignment based on an issue, right? You attach the issue to your pull request, and boom, all of the sudden, you have you have um, uh, 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 basically this is how we do, this fix. You go and say, okay, I'm only opening up this pull request because I need to solve this issue that's open. Now you have an issue in here. It says the location is the foundation services, add null validation for the modify routine. Cool, Sally. We good? You have assignments, fix the PR, create a PR for the issues, and then tomorrow we'll meet again and learn more. Okay,
Okay.
friend?
Thank you
Cool.
so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sally. You take care. Have a good night. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye.